Welcome to the Exam Study Expert Podcast, helping you hit the grades of your dreams at school, college, and university through the science of fast learning and lasting memory, the psychology of study productivity, and the secrets to great exam technique. And now your host, the Cambridge University trained psychologist who's dedicated his life to helping students study better and outsmart their exams, William Wadsworth.
Hello and welcome to the Exam Study Expert Podcast. This is the third instalment in our When I Grew Up series, which today looks at the competitive and demanding field of architecture, with architectural designer and teacher Dr. Gillean Denny. Gil, a very warm welcome to the Exam Study Expert Podcast.
Thank you for having me.
When people ask what you do, what do you tell them? What would you describe yourself as?
People tell me that I do too many things, and I think that's probably true. I do a number of things. So I'm first and foremost an architectural designer. I have taught architecture, currently taking a hiatus from that to raise two little girls.
Fantastic.
We'll hopefully get back to teaching because I miss it. But all the architectural designing still happens. I have an extensive background in theater. And have done lots of sustainable grassroots building projects dealing with all sorts of strange and innovative materials. So I've really gotten to play around with your non-standard building types, which is really exciting. And that's taken me all around the world. I've also worked as project manager and client rep for a number of very interesting large projects around the world. One of them, a zoo in China, currently doing something in Italy that I'm not allowed to talk about yet. That will be very, very exciting once I'm allowed to talk about it. A lot of the contract projects I get involved with now tend to be for very different things, and they keep me on my toes, and I have to do some extensive research for every single one because none of them are alike.
Well, it sounds like an amazingly rewarding, but no doubt also amazingly busy lifestyle. Fascinated to sort of hear what for you are the sort of the biggest rewards. You said you're kind of primarily described yourself as an architect. What sort of gets you up in the morning? What are the big motivating factors for what you do?
I would say problem solving. Every single design that you have has a set of challenges associated with it. And they're basically like being handed a jigsaw puzzle, except there are 5 different puzzles inside the same box, and somehow you have to make one puzzle out of them. It's just fun to try and get all the pieces to fit together the best way they possibly can. And usually it comes out, the answer is something that you never thought of before. And that moment of, aha, here's the answer, that just makes it worth it.
Amazing.
Yeah.
What would your advice be to anyone that's perhaps at that stage of thinking about architecture or wondering if it might be for them?
I would say that there are more people who have studied architecture not doing architecture than you would think. So the majority of people who in university study architecture honestly go into it thinking they're going to be an architect.
Sure.
End up not doing architecture at all. The majority of architecture students go on to be politicians and urban planners and community organizers. And architecture school teaches you to solve problems through design. And that design might not end up being floor plans, but it teaches you how to organize and teaches you how to communicate. And because of that, it's just amazing the resources that architecture school ends up giving people to do other things. So keeping that in mind, there are plenty of people I went to school with who don't look at a single floor plan at all anymore, and yet they're still using their architecture skills every single day. So I actually went into architecture school. I did not want to be an architect. I wanted to do production design for theaters and movies, and I was told that the best way to go about doing that was to go to architecture school. So I said, great, and that's what I did. And it was actually in architecture school that I discovered that I actually like designing buildings. Specifically, I like designing sustainable buildings. And I learned about all these really cool materials like straw bale, and like just random things that people were doing that weren't your normal buildings that you saw every day. And that got me into actually enjoying being sort of your standard architect. So now I do a mishmash of both things. I still do the theater and production design, but I also now do your more traditional architecture with an actual building that people live in. And it was actually bizarrely going to architecture school that made me want to be an architect.
Well, it sounds like the school did its job, huh? That's really cool. That's really cool. Presumably this was it back at high school you were sort of thinking of this career in production design for theatre and for movies? Tell me a little bit about that. What sparked that interest?
I spent lots of time in high school doing theater, and I discovered I was on stage performing in theater, and I found that I was actually having more fun making the sets that other people were using. So I started spending much more time behind the scenes and actually in front of the scene. And then when I went to undergrad, I kept doing that just as a hobby. And when I got to grad school, I ended up, regardless of what my supervisors might have liked, I pretty much ended up living in the theater full time while somehow trying to do a PhD in architecture that had nothing to do with theater, absolutely nothing to do with it. Theater started as a hobby and it became all consuming. But being involved in theater made me start being interested in production design. And it was actually a conversation. I was taking an art class at Moore College of Art in Philadelphia. And it
was this in your undergraduate?
This was in high school. When I was in high school. Okay. I was in high school. I was taking an illustration course. I was learning how to do cartooning, just for fun. Uh-huh. And the teacher that I had was also a production designer. And I had said that I really enjoyed doing production design and I wanted to go to school for it. And I was looking at different schools and having a very hard time finding a university that actually specialized in production design. There are some, but at the time they weren't places that they were either too far out of my budget or they were not geographically someplace that I wanted to spend time, or anyway, there were restrictions.
Sure.
So it was actually this teacher that said, oh, well, most production designers start out as architects. And so that made me start looking at architecture school. And here I am today.
Amazing. If I'm in the shoes of someone who's thinking about applying for architecture at college, what are the sorts of things I need to think about? What are the sorts of considerations for kind of whether I know it's for me? And then once I have decided it's for me, what are the things I should be thinking about doing in order to make a success of those applications?
Well, the first thing you want to really think about is there are two different ways of going about architecture school. So one of them is liberal arts. And in liberal arts, you will do your architecture courses, but you also take courses for general requirements for the university that aren't your architecture courses. And then there are schools that specialize where from day one, all you're doing is your architecture courses, and that's it. Those are your non-liberal arts schools.
I guess the latter would be perhaps more typical of a course in the UK as well.
Yes. Yeah. So typically there are some liberal arts universities in the UK.
Okay.
But predominantly, you're right. The UK model is for architecture school is largely you just do architecture courses and that's it. And it's not just architecture studio. You're also learning about architectural history. You're learning about how the profession works. You're learning about just dealing with all the aspects of an entire design project from start to finish and all the different people you would be working with during that process. So it's not just in your studio designing buildings all the time.
Yeah. There's quite a rounded skill set.
Yeah. Now, when in a liberal arts course, universities that do liberal arts, your semesters also tend to be longer. So because of that, you can fit more coursework into it, and it allows more courses to be fit in. Mm-hmm. I would say what I always tell all of my students is that both methods absolutely have their merits. One is not better than the other, But having seen both sides, I would say there is absolute merit to the liberal arts just process, because you never know from a design standpoint, you never know where you're going to get that aha magical moment that allows you to fit the pieces together. And almost every single time I've ever had that aha moment, it has come from a design idea that had nothing to do with building. So, I had a design idea aha moment when I remembered a course that I had once about adaptation and evolution, and how one creature the legs had moved underneath and created all of these different evolutions. And this creature had gone from swimming to crawling to walking. And that process, that aha moment of how to solve my building dilemma, actually came from an evolution course that I had taken in sophomore year. So you never know where you're going to get a design idea from. And the more you can learn, the more aha moments you're going to have, because you just have a bigger toolkit to work with.
Yeah.
So if you are very much into self-study, you might be learning tons of things on the side and reading tons of things that don't pertain to your discipline. And that's great. For most of us, we don't necessarily have that drive, or we don't know where that next thing's going to come. So in a university liberal arts setting, they sort of force you need to take this many science courses.
Yeah.
Well, great. I'm going to learn about the solar system, or I'm going to learn about geology, or I'm going to learn about something just for a couple of weeks. And you never know when that's going to be useful.
Yeah. And I guess that potentially reads across into other disciplines apart from architecture, that kind of breadth of academic exposure and having ideas about science and literature and all sorts of different avenues. As you said, you never know when your next idea might come from. And that could be true in a discipline like, business, just as much as architecture, potentially.
And I will say, architecture is definitely a discipline where finance, politics, material resources, international relations, all of these affect how buildings have been designed historically and how buildings are being designed today. Mm-hmm. So you have a better understanding of all these different pieces that exist in the world. It makes it much easier to understand where we've come from mm-hmm. as architects and where we're going. It gives you a better footing to stand on when you start to understand, building with steel is suddenly so much more expensive because of the international relations issues and economic issues surrounding China, and China's soaking up all the world's steel.
Right.
Suddenly, architecture is utterly integrated into everything else happening everywhere in the world. It's fascinating that way. It goes back to that jigsaw puzzle idea.
Yeah. Okay, we're now at college studying architecture through either one of the routes you describe. What are the sorts of things you'd advise students to think about in order to get the most out of their time at college or university?
Yeah. Well, first thing I would say is when you're choosing your university, you want to make sure that it either has built into the coursework an ability to do a semester abroad somewhere and study abroad, or has the ability through the larger university to do that, and make sure that whatever architecture department you're in has that flexibility built into it. You don't want to go, one of the things that I think is utterly important for studying architecture is to just remove yourself to someplace new for a semester and just give yourself and your brain the experience to just soak it up. Just go somewhere different. It just changes your perspective. And I think as a designer, that's utterly important. Just give yourself that moment. So make sure that your department either sends students purposefully or has flexibility built into it that you can do it on your own. So that's one fundamental. But once you're there and you've decided on which department you're going to be with, your studio becomes, I remember the first day of architecture studio, our teacher standing up in front of the class and going, look at everybody in this class. They are the only people you are going to see for the next 5 years. Make friends. And also don't date them because you're going to be stuck in this room with them for the next 5 years. This is sage advice. And you know what? He was 100% true. Architecture students live and breathe studio. You might go in there and say, no, I'm going to get my work done on time. I'm not going to be doing overnighters. I'm not going to be that student. You will be that student. Every student is that student. And the ones that don't put in that time, it shows in the work that they do. And then they leave and they don't do architecture anymore. The majority of architecture students leave the department and choose a different path by the end of their second year. And that's across the board. That's true of every department. The class sizes, our class started with 100 students, somewhere around there. And by the end of second year, we were reduced to, I think, about 40. So, and that's a known factor. That's every department has this statistic.
So a lot of hard work, quite a drop-off rate. It's
a lot of hard work, but it's fun. You're not up all night studying, right? You're not all up night studying to do an exam. You're up hanging out with your friends in studio, having chats, listening to music, having a good time, and you're doing a design or you're building a model. It's fun. Like, it really is fun, but you have to be willing to have your fun there. Right? Architecture is not a discipline for people who want to go out and party all weekend. You won't get your work done. So I'm not saying you can't have fun, but you have to, if you want to be successful, you need to be willing to put in the hours. And so when you were asking about extracurriculars, this is actually how I found my love of architecture, was through these extracurriculars in the department. There were a whole bunch of other building projects that were going on that were real life building projects that the university was involved in. So I could spend my time working on this fictitious one that was on paper only on my desk, or I could spend a lot of time helping to design and then physically build a real building and actually see it. I could build it, I could touch it. For some of these projects, I got to travel, which was awesome. But these are the projects that made me love architecture and have really carried through. And it's the same sort of architecture I still do today. So I got to do these fun extracurriculars and hang out with really amazing people from other disciplines who are being brought in to help do these building projects. But I was spending time out in Montana, building with Native Americans, the Northern Cheyenne, for a couple of weeks, building these buildings. I built a building that got to go hang out in DC and have several million people wandering through it over the course of a month. These really fun projects, but they were real, right? They weren't just drawings on a paper. They were real projects. So if you're looking for architecture schools, ask your departments or your prospective departments, do you do anything? Do you do these design build projects? Something that that's real, that I can actually physically see, that I can get involved in. And I found, by and large, that many of my professors were willing to kind of not necessarily accept these sorts of projects in replacement of my other work. But I was able to get university credit for doing these projects instead of taking other classes that I would have otherwise taken. So, my extracurriculars became my curriculars, and That was pretty awesome.
That's really neat. All that experience also sets you up even better for when you start to think about what comes after college, after university, those first steps into your career.
Oh, hands down. So over the course of your undergrad experience, you will be developing a portfolio, and that portfolio of all of your work in class will help you to get your first internship in an architecture department. It'll help you get your first real job. If you think that grad school and you want to develop more expertise in some particular area, it will help you get that grad school position. It will help you get those scholarships so you can afford to go to grad school. And absolutely, the projects that I worked on in class versus these extracurricular sort of projects that I did, it was the extracurricular projects that are the reason why I was able to fully fund grad school and why I was even able to get the grad school position, why I've been able to secure every design project contract that I have gotten going forwards. Something real and concrete is always better than something as fantastic as it is, something that's just a drawing on a page. As people like things that are real. They're just fun.
Yeah, no, for sure. You mentioned grad school a couple of times there. What is that something that should be part of everyone's architecture training, or is that sort of just for a few? Why would I kind of go down that route?
I would say it's changed significantly over the last 10 years, the role of grad school in architecture. So previously, you would only go to grad school as an architect if either you were previously in your undergrad studying biology or chemistry or business or something, and then later on decided that you wanted to do architecture. So you'd go and do a master's in architecture. It would basically be a crash course in architectural studio and professional degree. And then you could go for your licensing. So it was sort of a shortened track for a more mature student to get an architectural training. Getting a PhD in architecture was always just a lofty academic pursuit. So you were going to probably end up teaching architecture, and you wanted to think about architecture from a much more academic kind of whichever direction you wanted to take. Usually a PhD in architecture doesn't necessarily deal with building design, and it usually deals with how people use space and some capacity of that. So architecture at the grad school level, at the PhD level, is a bit more ephemeral. It has changed. So nowadays, there are many more specialty master's programs available for architecture, and they deal with sustainability and materials and high efficiency and power generation and urban planning. There's a whole smattering of different things that didn't even exist as a master's when I was looking at grad school. And if these things had existed, I probably would not have pursued a PhD. I probably would have just gotten a master's in one of these things and been done with it. Increasingly, I think, unfortunately, just like everything else related to higher academia, the more people who have undergrad degrees, a bachelor's degree in whatever the discipline is, pushes more people to then have more masters, and then more people to have more PhDs who would have previously just had masters, right? So the entire movement just keeps happening.
The bar shifts.
But in architecture, you still only, if you want to work as an architect in an architecture firm, a bachelor's in architecture, you're going to then go and work in a firm, and you're going to learn a lot of the practicalities of actually being an architect, not in school, but actually in a firm, working in that firm. And then you could always go back if you wanted to specialize in something, if you wanted to eventually become a partner in the firm and you wanted to specialize and bring something important to that firm, you can go back and get a master's in whatever that thing is. So
you mentioned licensing as well. What's that?
So architecture, so I do not call myself an architect because I am not licensed. I'm an architectural designer. So an architect who has a license can stamp a drawing so that it can be built. If you stamp that drawing, you are taking full legal liability if something goes wrong. So it's a important big step. Before you can even get to that licensing part, you have to put in a certain amount of time. Usually it takes a couple of years working on different parts of the architectural process for a firm, and whatever firm you're working for needs to sign off that you have done all of these hours in these different areas so that you fully understand the scope of what you're taking on. And then you have a very long exam that usually is done in several pieces over the course of a year, dealing with all the different parts of the architecture process, from designing the building to managing the construction of the building to dealing with all the different people that are going to be interacting with your building, all your stakeholders. If you make it all the way through that process and you become a licensed architect, then you can set up your own firm if you want to. You could become a project manager within the existing firm that you're already with, and then you have a whole bunch of non-licensed architects working underneath you, and you become in charge of a whole design project, which is usually where people try to end up. It's The unfortunate thing about having a license is that your license is only good for the region that you're in. So, for example, in the United States, licensing is by state. So a licensed architect in Pennsylvania cannot stamp a drawing for California. Because it's different code requirements. You're dealing with earthquakes or tornadoes or hurricanes, and all of these different pieces change how the buildings have to be built. So an architect who specializes in that area needs to stamp it to make sure it can be built. So that's why I never got a license, because I was practicing all around the world. What would be the point of getting a license for one particular place when all of my projects were everywhere else? So instead, if my project warrants it, I do the utmost I can, having fully researched what I'm doing. I do the drawings to the best of my ability, and then I partner with an architect who is licensed, who can stamp a drawing in that region of wherever it's going to be built. And then, fortunately, they take on the legal liability of making sure it doesn't fall down. But so not getting a license is a choice. If you want to be able to do things that aren't in one space, then there's no point in actually getting one.
Makes sense. Any other sort of reflections on those first steps into a career?
I would say knowing what you don't want to do is almost as useful as knowing what you do want to do. I did not have a clear picture of what I did want to do, but I did increasingly have a better idea of what I did not want to do. I tried being an architect, working in an architect firm. I didn't dislike it, but I knew I didn't want that to be my life. That was not where my passion was headed. So I needed to figure out what was my route. I didn't really know. I'm still sort of figuring it out even years later. It just meanders. But I at least knew I was willing to admit to myself that this more traditional path of architecture was not for me. So I think if I could give one piece of advice to anybody, and this isn't necessarily just architecture, but it's okay to tell yourself what you don't want to do, even if you don't know what the opposite of that is.
I love that. I feel like there's sort of so much pressure on you as a young person growing up today to kind of have your dream about, this is going to be my dream job and it's going to be fantastic and rewarding and fulfilling. And, that's quite hard. That's quite a high bar.
I'm sure there are some people at 20 years old who know exactly what they want to do, and maybe maybe it is, and they go out and they do it and they're 100% happy. But for the rest of us, it constantly changes throughout life. So figure out what you want to do at that particular moment, or at least what you don't want to do, and go try something else.
I love that. I think that's great. I always ask if you're able to kind of go back in time, step into your time machine and collar your 16-year-old self, would there be anything else you'd say to her about paths through both sort of academia and studies, and also life and career more generally?
Stop being so worried about admitting to people that you enjoy doing what you're doing. I think as a high school student in particular, it's very hard to admit to yourself and also to other people just how much you genuinely enjoy, learning about this thing or spending your time doing that thing. As teenagers, we have sort of lemming personalities. We want, it's built into our biology. We want to do what the pack is doing. If I could go back and tell my 16-year-old self that it's okay to admit to people that you genuinely, absolutely enjoy reading, like that you absolutely enjoy spending tons of time just like drawing crazy floor plans for something, that you absolutely enjoy just hanging out in trees, building hammocks, and I think I would tell myself that I should invite my friends to try these things out too, because I discovered later on in life, in college and grad school, that there were a lot of other people who enjoyed doing those things too, and none of us were willing to admit it when we were younger. And we would have had so much more fun if everyone had just admitted that they enjoyed doing these really fun things, when we were 16 years old. Think of the cool tree houses we could have built.
No, I think that's fantastic. Whatever your passion is, whether it's floor plans or whether it's something completely different, not being afraid, particularly when you're still slightly younger, in your teens, not being afraid to be public about what you're passionate about, I think is really powerful. So thank you for that. Gil, look, thanks again for this. It's been a brilliant conversation. If there's anyone out there that's sort of wanting to find out more about sort of you and what you're up to, or maybe even get in touch, is there anything you'd suggest?
They can absolutely just email me, and I'm sure you can post my email with the podcast. So they're welcome to email me if they wish, and I would be happy to point them in any direction that I can. I would say if they are wanting to learn more about architecture and learn about architecture schools, I get lots of requests constantly from students that I've had or potential students about what architecture department, where in the world will be best for them. And honestly, the best person to answer that is yourself. So find out where in the world you want to spend 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, and start from there. If you want to be close to home, then start looking close to home. If you want to go somewhere far away from home, start looking far away from home. But think about where you're going to spend a couple of years, start there, and then look at what schools are available and ask the questions. Ask, do they have study abroad? Do they require a portfolio to even apply? And fundamentally, are there really interesting things that the department is doing that aren't necessarily part of the normal coursework that you could get involved in? Ask those questions. If the university doesn't have those options, check them off the list and find a different one. That would be my first step.
That sounds great. And again, I think very relevant to other disciplines, not just architecture. Figure out where you want to be, what kind of experience you want to have, and then come up with your shortlist. Figure out what questions you want to interrogate it with, and just work through. I think that's great. Listen, Gil, thank you ever so much for coming on the podcast. It's been a fantastic conversation. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to the Exam Study Expert podcast. Remember to hit subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. And please take a moment to write a review for our show in your podcast player.